Ok, estamos no ar. Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Pedimos desculpas por esse pequeno atraso. Nós tivemos um pequeno problema um problema técnico, mas estamos iniciando agora o segundo dia do nosso evento. É uma satisfação contar com a presença de todos e todas. Agradeço desde logo os participantes, os membros do grupo de pesquisa em subconstitucionalismo, a professora Gisiela Iensui, que está aqui conosco, que é a coordenadora junto comigo deste evento. Agradeço especialmente a presença dos professores doutores Anna Gamper, Jared Sonnicksen e Johanna Schnabel, que estão falando conosco diretamente da Europa nesse momento. Então, é uma satisfação recebê-los. Eu gostaria de iniciar o evento agradecendo também alguns parceiros, né? Especialmente o Centro Acadêmico e o Constate, que é o centro liderado pelo professor Marcelo Labanca, em Recife, que é nosso parceiro de longa data e que apoia este evento. Dear speakers, Professor Anna Gamper, Professor Johanna Schnabel, and Professor Jared Sonnicksen, I'm sorry. On behalf of the Research Center on Subnational Constitutionalism of the Federal University of Mato Grosso do Sul, SubConst, I would like to welcome you and thank you for accepting the invitation and sharing your time and knowledge to discuss with us the interesting topics on the events program. This will be an event of great importance to the development of SubConst's activities since until now. We focused our research activities mainly in the Latin American federations like Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, and in English-speaking federations like USA and Canada and Australia. Then I think that we need to know a little or a lot more about the German-speaking federations, and then this event is very important to us. Then thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Eu vou passar a palavra agora para a professora Gisiela, para que ela faça uma breve apresentação do currículo dos nossos palestrantes, e em seguida nós começaremos com as conferências. Por favor, professora Gisiela.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Gostaria de, primeiramente, agradecer a todos os participantes, agradecer também aos professores, por ter aceitado o nosso convite. Eu passaria agora a fazer a leitura do currículo, dos professores. Anna Gamper, professora da Universidade de Innsbruck, Áustria, graduada em Direito pela Universidade de Innsbruck, Áustria, doutora em Direito pela mesma universidade, com estudos na Universidade de Cambridge e no King's College, Reino Unido, coordenadora do Centro de Pesquisas em Federalismo da Universidade de Innsbruck, juíza substituta do Tribunal de Direito Público do Principado de Liechtenstein, autora de inúmeros livros, capítulos e artigos. Johanna Schnabel, professora no Instituto Otto Suhr de Ciência Política da Universidade Livre de Berlim, Alemanha, doutora em Ciência Política pela Universidade de Lausanne, Suíça, mestre em Ciência Política, História e Filosofia pela Universidade Justus Liebig, Gießen, Alemanha, autora também de livros, capítulos e artigos. E, por fim, o Jared Sonnicksen, professor na Universidade Técnica da Renânia-Westfália, Alemanha, doutor e mestre em Ciência Política pela Universidade Friedrich Wilhelms de Bonn, Alemanha, foi professor e pesquisador associado do Instituto de Ciência Política da Universidade Técnica de Darmstadt, Alemanha, foi professor visitante na Universidade Técnica de Darmstadt, no Instituto Otto Suhr de Ciência Política da Universidade Livre de Berlim, bem como na Universidade de Sterling, Reino Unido, e em outros países, como China e Japão. Autor de livros, capítulos e artigos científicos. Eu vou a palavra agora para o professor Luiz Fernando, para que a gente possa prosseguir com o nosso evento.
Ok. Muito obrigado pela apresentação, professora. Feita essa breve apresentação dos nossos conferencistas, sem mais delongas, eu passo a palavra para a professora Anna Gamper, que vai proferir a conferência intitulada Recent Developments in Austrian Subnational Constitutionalism. Please, Professor Anna Gamper, The floor is with you. Thank you so much once again for be with us in this event. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. This is very kind of you. It's a pleasure to be here today. So it's dark outside. It's almost night in Austria. I wish you a good evening from the city of Innsbruck, which is in the west of Austria. First of all, I'd like to make you a little bit familiar with Austrian federalism before I say something about the Austrian subnational constitutions, and then I would like to make you acquainted with some more recent developments in Austrian subnational constitutionalism. As you may know, Austria is a rather unitary and symmetric federal state. Federalism goes back to the year 1920, when the Austrian Federal Constitutional Act was enacted. And federalism is one of the key constitutional principles, which means that it has a better protection than other pieces of constitutional law. If one would change or abolish federalism, then you would have to have a referendum in addition to the ordinary constitutional amendment procedure. And the Austrian Constitutional Court has already identified several key elements which altogether compose the principle of federalism. The court recognized the distribution of powers, the existence of a federal second chamber, fiscal cooperation, and also subnational constitutionalism as important elements of that constitutional principles. So subnational constitutionalism is one of the key elements of that leading constitutional principle of federalism in Austria. Now, I would like to ask Professor Sgarbossa perhaps to show us the small sheet. Yeah, thank you very much. If you could just scroll down a little bit, because here you'll find an outline of my presentation, and perhaps at the bottom line. Thank you so much. Yeah, Article 99. I think I would like to start talking about this a little bit, because if you look into the Federal Constitutional Act, which, as I said, dates back to 1920, but has been amended very, very often, 139 times so far, which is almost incredible. But Article 99 was there from the beginning, and that is the main federal constitutional provision regulating subnational constitutional autonomy, as we call it. The first paragraph is the most important. So here you find a term which you may be familiar with or not, which is the land. Land is the original name we use in Austria for describing a constituent state. So there are 9 constituent states that altogether form the Austrian federal system, and the plural is Länder. So I will use those terms during the presentation. Now, if you look at the first paragraph of Article 99, it seems to be rather enigmatic. It says the land constitution to be enacted by a land constitutional law can, inasmuch as the federal constitution is not affected thereby, be amended by land constitutional law. As a result, one could say, well, the federal constitution allows the Länder to enact their own subnational Länder constitutions. Each of the 9 Länder may adopt its own constitution in a land constitution making procedure, and the only condition is that the federal constitution is not affected thereby. So this is what we call a general clause, because here we don't find a list of piecemeal matters for which the lender gets, let's say, individual responsibility to regulate this or that matter, but it's a kind of general clause which gives some space to the lender for the enactment of their own constitutions. I'll get back to this in a minute, but I just would like to add that in the Federal Constitutional Act, there are some other provisions as well, apart from that general clause, but these are very individual piecemeal provisions, which in one context or another very concretely say that the land constitution may regulate this or that matter. But as I said, these are very piecemeal matters. So, for example, in the chapter regulated by the federal constitution, which is concerned with the Federal Court of Auditors, there you'll find a provision which says the lender, if they want to do so, they may establish their own regional courts of auditors by a land constitution. Or in another chapter of the Federal Constitution, where the Federal Ombudsman is regulated, you'll find a provision which says if the lender want to do so, they may, by a land constitutional act, also establish their own regional ombudsman. So let's say the primary source of subnational constitutional autonomy is located here in Article 99, but there are some more individual constitutional provisions as well. Now, the crucial question was what that wording, as you can find here on the screen, inasmuch as the federal constitution is not affected thereby, how that wording could be understood. That was the big question, because in the decades following the year 1920, when the federal constitution had been enacted, the understanding was that this meant a very small kind of constitutional autonomy, so a very small kind of space. Formerly, the opinion was that the lender were only allowed to repeat what the federal constitution already said with regard to the lender, because if you look at into the federal constitutional text, of course, you'll find many provisions there which already relate to the lender. For example, the federal constitution regulates the lender parliaments, the lender governments, and other provisions which are important for the lender. And so the understanding at the beginning was that the lender constitutions would only be allowed to repeat what the federal constitution already said and to regulate some more details. So what the federal constitution said generally, the lender constitutions could spell out in more detail, but nothing else. That was the situation firstly. And this situation lasted until the 1960s. And in that time, at that time, if you read a land constitutional text, they were more or less similar to each other. They differed from each other only with regard to some minor details. They were worded, let's say, according to a pattern constitutional text, which were more or less the same for all of them. But this changed because in the 1960s, one scholar of constitutional law wrote a famous book on the constitutional space, the constitutional autonomy of the lender. And then the Constitutional Court very soon followed this new doctrine. So with that, new book and the emerging case law in the 1960s, the situation changed. And since that time, we have had a different understanding of subnational constitutionalism in Austria. Since that time, the understanding is that the Länder constitutions may not only repeat what the federal constitution already says with regard to the Länder, but also put this into detail, but also, and that is the innovative thing, they may also supplement provisions. So the understanding is that where the federal constitution doesn't say anything at all about a certain matter, then a land constitution may feel free to regulate this matter. Of course, only with regard to the respective land. It must not regulate something for the federal level, but at land level, the constitution will be free to regulate that matter, even if the federal constitution is silent on that. And the Länder have indeed used that, let's say, more creative, more innovative space. And especially in the last years and the last 1 or 2 decades, we really find that they are innovative. Suddenly they have become different from each other. So we can find their own identities in a sense. Let me just show you some examples. It starts with the name of the constitution. So they bear different names. For example, the land where I live, the Tyrol, calls its own constitution not the land constitution, but the land order. If you look at the name of the Constitution of Vienna, which is the capital, a land and a municipality as well, there the name is City Constitution. So even the names are different. The only constitution that has a preamble is the constitution of my own land, the Tyrol, a preamble which mentions God, which mentions also the Tyrolean historical past at the time of the former Austro-Hungarian monarchy, where the Tyrol consisted of a much larger territory, including also parts of northern Italy, which is today northern Italy. So this is a very unique feature for a constitution to have a preamble. Then, of course, if you look into the substance of these constitutions, all of them, of course, include organizational provisions with regard to their parliaments, their governments, and the processes of making laws at the land level. But of course, with many differences. Let's think about the duration of a land parliament or a land government, the kind of election of the land government. So we find many differences here. Even more differences can be found with regard to state policies or state aims. So these constitutions usually at the beginning enlist a couple of state policies or state aims. And in the last years, they became really innovative. So we find some constitutions which include their unique state aims. For example, one constitution says that the Sunday, in the sense of having a day off, should be protected by the land, for example. Another land says in the constitution, regionalism and subsidiarity are state aims of that particular land. Then in many land constitutions, you will find state aims regarding environmental protection, climate protection, and other very interesting features. But these state aims are no fundamental rights. So these are objective guidelines, but they don't really vest the citizens with additional rights. However, there are some land constitutions which also establish fundamental rights in addition to the fundamental rights which are already granted at the federal constitutional level. This is, of course, beneficial to the land citizens where these additional rights are entrenched, for example, social welfare rights in some of the land constitutions. Another crucial issue, and I would like to treat this matter in a minute or so in more detail, is the issue of direct democracy. Here again, we find many differences between the land constitutions. This is really a space where in the last years or so, new provisions were enacted that really differ from one land to another. A last thing to be mentioned here, something which is also quite innovative, quite recent, and which is also token of the function of these Länder constitutions as laboratories, as we call them, is the possibility of a parliamentary investigative committee. So such committees, of course, have for a long time existed both at federal and land level, but some of the Länder began to adopt provisions in their constitutions which vested the parliamentary minority, the opposition, with the right to request a parliamentary investigative committee. Whereas at the federal level, this right was a majority right. And after the first Länder constitutions had established such a right, then suddenly the discussion switched also at the federal level, and the federal constitution also was changed. And they said, following the land constitutional example, the right to request a parliamentary investigative committee is a minority right. A fourth of the members of the National Council at federal level is sufficient to request such a committee. Now, let me have a look at 3 cases very quickly, which have more or less recently been decided by the Austrian Constitutional Court. This is also token of the Austrian hierarchy of legal norms, because, of course, the federal constitution is superior to the land constitution. So if a land constitution contravenes, according to Article 99, paragraph 1, contravenes, violates the federal constitution, then the Austrian Constitutional Court repeals the land constitution or the land constitutional provision. And the court has already done so in several cases. And I would now like to mention 3 examples. The oldest one, perhaps, which is now 20 years old or so, is popular legislation. I have already mentioned the issue of direct democracy. In that case, the land neighboring Switzerland and Liechtenstein, which are both countries with a high degree of direct democracy, this most western Austrian land, Vorarlberg, established a provision in its land constitution according to which popular legislation was allowed. And this means this is a kind of mechanism, a strong mechanism pertaining to direct democracy, where a citizen's initiative, which gets very, very strong support, is submitted to a binding referendum in the case that the regional parliament does not want to adopt such a law. So the parliament doesn't want to realize the citizens' initiative. But in that case, a referendum needs to take place even against the wishes of the parliament. And if the referendum supports the citizens' initiative, then, and that was the provision in that land constitution, then the land parliament is forced to adopt a respective law. So we call that mechanism popular legislation, and the Constitutional Court said no, it repealed that provision, arguing that the federal constitution includes a constitutional principle on democracy, but following an understanding that democracy in the federal constitutional sense was primarily representative democracy and not direct democracy. So there are some direct democratic elements in the federal constitution regarding the federal level, but only very minor provisions. The main principle is electoral law democracy, as we understand it as representative democracy. Now, the federal constitution is silent on all issues of direct democracy at the Länder level. It doesn't say anything about direct democracy at the Länder level. And so that land constitution in Vorarlberg, well, the lawmaker thought, well, it was free to establish popular legislation. When the federal constitution doesn't say anything about that, well, that is the new creative space for subnational constitutional law in Austria. But the Constitutional Court said no. And that is the tricky question, because the Constitutional Court says, of course, the land constitution must not violate explicit provisions of the federal constitution, but there are also implicit federal constitutional principles. And the Länder, when they enact constitutional law, have to observe implicit implicit principles as well. And that is a tricky issue, because how can they know in advance what the federal constitution implicitly thinks, so to say, what can be regulated by the Länder constitutions? Well, that was the first case. I just mentioned another case regarding climate protection. It's a much younger case. Here, the case took place in the region of Lower Austria. Here we find the airport of Vienna. And the question was whether a third landing piste could be built for the airport. And that was also a difficult case, which went up and down different kinds of courts and instances. And ultimately, it came up to the Constitutional Court. And one of the parties argued that the constitution of the land, Lower Austria, included a state aim, as I mentioned before, on climate protection, and that applying that state aim, one should not, for climate protection reasons, build a third landing piste for the airport. The Constitutional Court said again no, because a land constitution may include state aims, no problem about that, but these state aims are only applicable to matters regulated by land law. Building airports and landing pistes is a federal matter, and so the state aim provided by a land constitution is not applicable for that matter. The last case I would like to mention is just 2 years old. It concerns the land Styria in the south of Austria. Rather complicated question. I said before, the Länder are empowered to establish their own courts of auditors, additionally to the Federal Court of Auditors that is already provided by the federal constitution. And the land Styria, in its constitution, established a regional court of auditors and vested that court of auditors with the power to scrutinize private contracts made between the land and a private housing enterprise. And the land constitution also said, if the question how far that scrutiny of the regional court of auditors went was controversial, then that matter could be brought before the Austrian Overall Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court examined that land constitutional provision of Styria and found out that this was a matter which was not similar to the kinds of responsibilities exercised by the Federal Court of Auditors. And the Constitutional Court said, well, the subnational constitution is free to vest the Land Court of Auditors with additional rights, which the Federal Court of Auditors does not have. But if it does so, then the Land Constitution is not empowered to let the Constitutional Court, which is a federal body, decide on conflicts arising from that additional competence of the Regional Court of Auditors. They need to establish their own body scrutinizing conflicts arising from that additional competence, but it is not for the Land Constitution to invent new responsibilities of the Constitutional Court, which is a federal body. So that is the last case I wanted to mention, and I now see I'm talking even a little bit more than the 30 minutes granted to me, but let me just conclude very quickly. I would say from today's perspective that the space given to the land with regard to their own subnational constitutions in Austria nowadays is important, and it is used rather creatively and innovatively. But on the other hand, as we've seen, there is a clear limit and a body that really efficiently scrutinizes whether the land constitutions, the land constitutional lawmakers go beyond the red line which is drawn for the land subnational constitutions. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Professor Gamper. It's amazing to know a little more about the Austrian federalism and constitutionalism. And it seems interesting, the formulation, the weird, peculiar formulation of this kind of supremacy clause, maybe an homogeneity clause also in the Article 99 of the Austrian Federal Constitution. Later in the debates, I think that I have some questions and some collocations, some considerations to make about similar issues in Brazilian law. And then it's very interesting, the several of the points of her speech. Thank you so much. I will then invite Professor Johanna Schnabel to make your speech about the division of powers regarding affordable housing in Australia, Austria, Canada, and Germany, in a perspective of comparative federalism. Thank you so much, Professor Schnabel, and I give you the floor to share with us your knowledge and reflections about this amazing team. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And first of all, if you could also give me my slides, I would like to show to the participants, my slides, but I'll, perfect, thank you. So let me start by thanking you for the invitation to participate in this event. I'm only sad that I cannot be in Brazil in person. Now I'm based in Berlin. Berlin is a fantastic city. It has a lot to offer, but unfortunately the weather in November and December is just horrible. It's grim and cold all the time, so I would very much prefer to be at a Brazilian beach. But coming back to more serious matters, I'm very pleased to present on the division of powers in affordable housing policy in federal states. My presentation largely draws on an article that I've recently published together with my colleague Antonio Suarez. And the presentation will allow me to highlight 3 points. One is the importance of studying affordable housing policy in federal states, something that has not been done much. So it's not a policy that has gained much attention by federalism scholars, as you would notice very quickly if you do a quick Google Scholar search. The second point I would like to highlight is that how important it is to go beyond the division of powers to understand the balance of power between the two orders of government, or three orders of government if we consider Brazil, in a federal state. And thirdly, the presentation will allow me to provide some insights into the 4 countries that we examine in this paper. So by the end of this event, you'll be an expert on Austrian federalism, but I'll also give you some information on Australia, Canada, and Germany. Now, to start with the policy, we currently live in a situation of, we can nearly call it a global housing crisis. Many countries experience housing shortages and inadequate housing. It's difficult for people to find housing on the market and to find good housing. This is particularly the case for low-income households, which then raises the question about what to do. In response to the difficulties of low-income households, governments usually create some policies to help them either pay for housing or access housing. This is what is broadly known as affordable housing, though the specific instruments can vary from country to country. In the 4 countries that we examine, so those are Western federations, if we can call them that, affordable housing policy generally relies on 2 main instruments. I know that in other countries different instruments are used. Brazil has slightly different instruments, but the main instruments in the 4 countries that we examine are the housing allowance and social housing. The housing allowance is a cash transfer, so money that's given from government to households, which they can then use to pay towards rent. It might sometimes also be given to the landlord directly, but in any case, it's a cash transfer that benefits households. Social housing consists in the construction of housing units that are then dedicated or rented out to low-income households, so they need to meet certain eligibility requirements to be able to rent those houses at a rent that is below the market rent. In the past, social housing meant that, or could mean that governments actually had those buildings built and owned the buildings and rented them out. Nowadays, social housing policy generally means that government offers subsidies to social housing providers who will then build and manage those housing units. Now, considering these 2 policy instruments, the question we always ask when looking at federalism is about the relationship between the 2 orders of government. Federalism is a system of government that comprises at least 2 orders of government. As I said, Brazil has, and you might know that better than me, Brazil has 3 orders, but in the 4 countries that we examine, there are 2 orders of government. These governments have meaningful powers. They're responsible for at least an important area of modern government, and their powers and status is constitutionally entrenched. Now, as I said, what we're interested in is to know how do these orders of government relate to, and in the end, political science, which is what I do, is interested in power. Or you want to find out which one is the more important, is a more powerful actor in a federation. Many colleagues have tried to examine that by focusing at the general level of centralization, decentralization of a country. There's several indicators we can use. No one has so far looked at affordable housing policy specifically, and generally centralization, decentralization are either measured, as I said, as a general level of the country or for broader policy areas. Now, as you can see here, I use this scale to represent the relationship between the federal government and the constituent units. And you can see the federal government is slightly higher up. That's the reality of most federations. The federal government is the more powerful actor, but the constituent units can be, say, slightly higher, slightly lower, depending on the country. And that's important, depending on the policy area. So what we wanted to find out with our little study is what is the relative importance of the federal government and the constituent units regarding affordable housing policy? What's the degree of centralization, decentralization of affordable housing policy in Australia, Austria, Canada, and Germany? To do this, we developed a scheme. Actually, it was meant to build up step by step on the slide. Didn't do that, so I'm throwing all this at you at once. Typically, what federalism scholars do, what constitutional lawyers do, and I hope no offense, is that they look at legislative authority. They'll check the constitution and see what does the constitution say, which order of government is responsible, or does it just automatically give everything for which the other order is not responsible to the lower or to the other order of government. And this might give a good image. Austria is a very good example. In Austria, social housing, the housing allowance are an exclusive authority of the lender. Federal government has hardly any say. So if we check legislative authority in Austria, we know the lender are the more important actor when it comes to affordable housing policy. End of story, more or less. Now, if we look at other countries, we might see that legislative authority is divided, but one order of government is responsible for one instrument and the other order of government is responsible for the other instrument, which then raises the question, what do we do with this situation? And I'll go back to that in a second, because there's another situation that we need to take into consideration, and that's a situation where authority is shared. In Australia and Canada, both orders of government can provide social housing and they can provide a housing allowance. Now, what typically happens is if one order of government decides to provide one of those instruments or both instruments, the other order does not provide that instrument anymore, or would only provide like a one-off payment or a very small program. But typically one of the instruments is clearly under control of the order of government that decides to provide that instrument. Now, if we have a situation where federal government decides to provide both instruments, again, end of story, we know that federal government is the most important actor. Or we might have a situation where constituent units decide to provide both instruments, in which case they are the more important actor. But what we might also find is that the federal government decides to provide one instrument and the constituent units decide to provide the other instrument. If we have this situation, to find out which order of government is more important, we need to examine the importance of instruments. And what we can usually see in affordable housing policy is that one instrument is more important. So for instance, in Australia and Germany, and I'll go back to that later on, the housing allowance is the main instrument to provide affordable housing to low-income households. So the order of government that controls that instrument, if the instruments are divided between the two orders of government, is the more important actor. And we would say if that's the federal government, the policy is centralized. If it's the constituent units, the policy is decentralized. And this gives, so these taking legislative authority and the importance of instruments into account, we know whether affordable housing policy is centralized or is decentralized. But that's not the end of the story. We need to factor in two other important factors. The first one is conditional grants, which are financial transfers given to the constituent units by the federal government that the constituent units must use in line with certain conditions specified by the federal government. Conditional grants are provided based on what is called the federal spending power, so the authority of the federal government to provide financial assistance and add conditions to this financial assistance in areas under the jurisdiction of the constituent units. So conditional grants give the federal government a say on policies for which it is not responsible, for which it has no authority. Federal spending power can be very broad, such as in Australia, where the federal government can provide money in literally every area at once, or it can be more constrained, like in Germany, where the constitution specifies in which areas and for what purposes the federal government can offer conditional grants to the lender. What conditional grants mean is that if the federal government provides conditional grants to co-finance an instrument that's under control of the constituent units, it has more of an influence. So if, for instance, social housing and the housing allowance were under control of the constituent units, but the federal government offers conditional grants, policy is still decentralized, but it's less so than if the federal government does not offer conditional grants. Now, the other factor we need to take into consideration is the existence of a functional division of powers. And that has, in a way, works the opposite way to conditional grants. It gives the constituent units more of a say over an instrument that's controlled by the federal government. A functional division of powers means that the federal government regulates, I think that's a Brazilian term, it regulates a policy, but the constituent units are responsible for implementation and administration, for the execution of the policy, in which case they can shape the policy a little bit, tailor it a little bit to their own preferences or circumstances. So they play a bit of a role in the instrument that is controlled by the federal government. Now, taking all this together gives us an idea of which order of government is the more important order in regard to affordable housing policy. All this is very theoretical for now. I'll offer some illustration in a minute. Now, if you put all this into a somewhat nice graph, we can get a analytical framework that can walk you step by step to identify which order is the more important one in affordable housing policy. So if you look at step 1, first you identify whether an instrument is under the exclusive authority is an exclusive authority or if it's shared. If it's an exclusive authority of the federal government, so if both instruments are an exclusive authority of the federal government, affordable housing policy is very centralized. It's less so if there's a functional division of powers, so the federal government controls both, legislates on both instruments, but the constituent units implement them because then they have a little influence. If each order of government has exclusive authority over one instrument, as I told you, we first need to check which one is more important. If the one controlled by the federal government is more important, affordable housing policy is centralized, but it is more so if the federal government offers conditional grants and there is no functional division of powers, compared to a situation where federal government offers conditional grants, but there is also a functional division of powers, or there are no conditional grants, no functional division of powers, and there's an even lower degree of centralization if the federal government does not offer conditional grants for the other policy instrument, and there's a functional division of powers, meaning constituent units implement the instrument that's controlled by the federal government. If the most important instrument is that controlled by the constituent units, again, we can have different degrees depending on whether the federal government provides conditional grants for that instrument and whether the constituent units implement the other instrument, the less important one, that is under legislative authority of the federal government. If both policy instruments are under control of the constituent units, the policy is very decentralized, though less so if the federal government offers conditional grants. And as I said, depending on whether policy if legislative authority is shared, we first need to check which order of government decided to provide, and then we can do the same analysis again. Now, before giving you some more specific examples, and I'll provide them in through two comparisons, let me first give you a little bit of background on the 4 countries that we look at. Now, Austria, I don't think I need to say too much about it. You know by now that it has been a federation, or was a federation after 1920, then not so much for a short period of time thanks to the Germans, and then reestablished federalism in 1949. I guess the specific constitutional mechanisms Anna Gamper could explain much better. It has 9 Länder, and that's important, it has what's called administrative federalism, so many federal laws are implemented by the Länder. Austria, to my knowledge, in Austria, to my knowledge, federal government has a broad spending power, though I must admit that's the only piece of information I didn't double check. So there might be certain constraints that I'm not aware of that maybe Anna Gamper would like to specify later on. Austria is a highly centralized federation, so most policies are actually controlled by the federal government. Federal government has very broad jurisdiction, and spoiler alert, the interesting thing is that affordable housing policy is an exception. That's actually a policy area where the Länder play a very important role. Now, moving on to Australia. Australia has been a federation since 1901. It comprises 6 states, so fewer states, even though it's significantly larger than Austria. It differs from Austria not only in terms of size, but also in terms of the type of federalism. Australia has dual federalism, which means that the order of government that legislates, or that regulates a policy, also implements that policy. The federal government implements its own laws. In Australia, federal government has a very, very broad spending power, can intervene in whatever policy area it wants, and has done so very extensively. It's also a centralized federation, though less so than Austria. Canada has been a federation since 1867. It comprises 13 provinces, 10 provinces and 3 territories to be more specific, though I won't go into detail about that. Like Australia, it is a dual federation, meaning the order of government that legislates on a policy also implements that policy. The federal government also has a rather broad spending power, which is similar to Australia, but Canada is different to Australia and the other 3 cases in that it's a very decentralized, actually one of the most decentralized federations in the world, and the only one that has resisted a trend of centralization. Now, finally, Germany has been or was a federation after 1871. Again, disrupted for a certain period of time. It was not a very democratic federation at the beginning, then re-established federalism in 1949, at least in Western Germany, and then including Eastern Germany after reunification. Germany has 16 Länder, and like Austria, has administrative federalism, meaning that legislation adopted by the federal government is generally implemented and administered by the Länder. The federal spending power is limited. The constitution only authorizes several instances in which the federal government can offer financial assistance to the Länder and make them respect certain conditions. Germany is also a centralized federation. Now, having given this background, let's dive into affordable housing policy. The first comparison I would like to present is that between Australia and Germany. So please remember that little graph I showed you earlier about the different factors we need to take into consideration to identify whether affordable housing policy is centralized or decentralized, whether it's very centralized or very decentralized. Now, Australia and Germany, again, are 2 countries that we wouldn't necessarily think are alike. But when it comes to affordable housing policy, they're very much alike, namely because the housing allowance is controlled by the federal government. So if you are a recipient of a housing allowance, you will ask the federal government for it, while social housing is controlled by the constituent units. This is in Germany because the housing allowance is a concurrent jurisdiction. Social housing is and social housing is an exclusive jurisdiction of the Länder. In Australia, affordable housing, so both instruments are shared authorities, but the federal government decided to provide a housing allowance, and the states decided to provide a social housing policy. In both countries, the housing allowance is the more important instrument in affordable housing policy. So what we would conclude is that in both countries, there's the same degree of centralization. Now, if we take into consideration the provision of conditional grants, we'll also notice that in both countries, the federal government supports a social housing policy in the constituent units by offering conditional grants. It hasn't done so in Germany for a little while, but since constitutional amendment in 2019, it has returned to offering that kind of support. So again, we would conclude, same story, same degree of centralization. But now if we factor in the functional division of powers related to administrative federalism, we'll notice that in Germany, the Länder implement the housing allowance. Actually, I just said I would ask if you're eligible for the housing allowance, you'd ask the federal government. Actually, not quite true. In Germany, you ask the Land because the Land implements the federal housing allowance. This is not the case in Australia. So what we see here is that in both countries, affordable housing policy is centralized, but is more centralized in Australia than it is in Germany, because the Länder implement the housing allowance in Germany and control social housing. Now, moving on to the other paired comparison, affordable housing policy in Austria and Canada. Again, we would not necessarily think those are very similar countries, yet they are. In both countries, the housing allowance and social housing are controlled by the constituent units. This has not always been the case. In Austria, in the beginning, both were actually controlled by the federal government. They were then step by step handed over to the constituent units. In Austria, both are now, as far as I understand, an exclusive authority, while in Canada, they are a shared authority, but the provinces, again, complicated story, but the provinces ended up deciding to provide housing allowances and social housing policy. So if we look at that, we would say, yeah, same degree of decentralization in this case, right? Not centralization, but decentralization. But there are two important differences. One is that in Canada, the federal government, decided to provide conditional grants to the provinces to support social housing policy and shape social housing policy. This gives it a say over a policy that's controlled by the constituent units. This is not the case in Austria, and I should add anymore. This means that affordable housing policy is less decentralized in Canada than Austria, which is kind of surprising given that Austria is the highly centralized federation in the sample and Canada the most decentralized federation. On top of that, the federal government in Canada has created, every once in a while, smaller temporary federal social housing programs and housing allowances using the shared authority over that. This means affordable housing policy is even less decentralized in Canada than in Austria. If we put this in our nice little graph, we can see that, we can illustrate those differences. So if you look at Australia and Germany in the little turquoise box, you can see that Australia is more centralized than Germany because it does not have the functional division of powers, because the states don't implement the affordable housing policy instrument controlled by the federal government. And we can see on the bottom the comparison Austria and Canada, where we can see that Austria is more decentralized than Canada because the federal government does not provide conditional grants, which it does in Canada. And but I'm not going to go into detail in this. Historically, the countries actually are located in different sections of that graph because things have changed over time. Now, to conclude, first of all, I would like to emphasize that we try to develop this framework to measure the relative importance of the two orders of government, so the degree of de/centralization, in a way that goes beyond formal powers and that provides a more accurate picture. Our framework allows to compare countries and to map changes over time. Now, question is, what is the external validity of our framework? Can it be applied to different settings, to other countries and policy areas? We believe it can, but it probably requires adaptation. So for instance, if you think about Brazil, it won't be enough to just look at the federal government and the states. We would obviously need to factor in the municipalities as well. If you would like to know more about the decentralization of affordable housing policy in Brazil, please stay tuned. We're just working on a paper with two colleagues based at a federal university in Sao Paulo, which we hope to submit to a journal next year. And then maybe by this time next year, you could read it. What I would, and I'll finish on that, like to highlight is that affordable housing policy is a pressing issue. And it's particularly interesting to look at it from a federalism perspective because it's a policy where we need to strike a balance between local service provision, all the advantages that has, and the idea of social citizenship, which requires national uniformity, usually calls for federal government intervention. And on the other hand as well, the federal government's superior fiscal resources, often constituent units are constrained in what they can do in terms of providing policy, which raises the question about the importance of conditional grants as a mechanism that might strike a balance it allows the federal government to enhance the financial capacity of the constituent units, give it a little bit of a say, but without centralizing the policy and taking it over. On that note, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Professor Schnabel. An amazing presentation with so interesting comparative framework of the four federal systems and an amazing methodology. I think that we of the legal area have much to learn with the political scientists than the methodologies that the political science provides to analysis of of public policies and a lot of other issues that are that concerns also to the public law is very rich. Thank you so much. I have some questions and some commentaries to make, but I will reserve them for the final moment. Okay. Thank you so much. Then I think that the technical problem with the sound of Professor Jared Sonnicksen is solved. Then I want to invite Professor Jared Sonnicksen to talk to us about the theme subnational constitutionalism in a tightly coupled federal system, the case of German Länder. Thank you so much, Professor Jared. It's a pleasure have you with us in this day of our webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, good afternoon.
I think that now we have another problem with your audio. A moment, please. Can you try again? Do anyone hear Professor Jared?
Yes, it's still not working. Oh, jeez, I
To me, I can hear a little bit, but it's too loud, you Professor.
Okay. Hello. Let me try one thing. Is it better? Did it get better?
No,
Still not better.
anything. It's Professor Anna, Professor Johanna. You can hear Professor Jared?
I can hear
No,
you, but you can't hear me, right?
I don't know why, but your sound is very loud.
Yeah, because I can hear you. I can hear you. The volume is too low. Now I turn this.
I'm so sorry. I
It's
will
happening.
try to talk with you
Give me 1 second.
in the chat. A moment, please.
And now test. Okay.
These are the problems about this modality of events. Sometimes we have this kind of interference. I'm sorry so a lot. Okay. We can. Thank you for your suggestion. We will start the discussions, and Professor Jared will try to log out and log in again to see if his sound starts again. Thank you so much, Professor. I would like to make some commentaries and some initiate with some questions to Professor Gamper. I don't know, Professor, if I'm pronouncing correctly. I think not. It's
Well,
Gamper.
I would say Anna Gamper, but
Anna
no
Gamper.
problem at all. No
I'm
problem.
sorry. I am Americanized your I anglicized the pronunciation of your name. I'm sorry. Um, Professor Gamper, I think that we have a lot of interesting aspects in your presentation. I think that first of all, there is some kind of similarities between Austria and Brazil in this particular sense, because we have in Brazil also the states reduced to the condition to only repeat the federal constitution with a very small space and autonomy to innovation. This is due to several characteristics or features of Brazilian constitutional system and federalism. It's federalism quite centralizing and quite uniformizing. In the same federal constitutions, there are a lot of norms of pre-ordination or pre-organization of the subnational entities, uniformity clauses or homogeneity clauses, and so on, and also because of the actuation or the actuation of the Supreme Court, the Brazilian Supreme Court, because most of the essays of innovation of the state legislator is declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. And in your speech, you made me remember the word of Lawrence Tribe, the Invisible Constitution, and also as well as in Austria, I think that also in Brazil we have some kind of invisible constitution, because the Supreme Court considers itself able to dictate to the states all the limitations of their autonomy and even their constitutional autonomy, even when there is no support for this in the text of the federal constitution. How is the relationship about the you mentioned three interesting cases of the Constitutional Court of Austria, but there is some kind of particular reflection by the justice of the Constitutional Court, the Austrian Constitutional Court, about the judicial review of subnational law. I made this question because in Brazil there is no difference. The Supreme Court makes the same kind of judicial review of federal or state law, and it is a more intense incidence of nullification of norms, state norms that are declared null and void and unconstitutional in comparison with federal norms. In the doctrine, the literature in Brazil considers that problematic because of the invasion of the autonomy of subnational entities by the federal judicial review. There is some in some aspect in the jurisprudence of Austrian Constitutional Court some reflection about this, Professor Gamper. Sorry.
No problem at all. Thank you. Well, thank you for that very interesting question. This is fascinating. So I find some similarities, but also differences. I think one similarity is that we do have an apex court that is really important for the interpretation of the federal constitution with regard also to the space of subnational constitutionalism. Because in both cases, if I understood you rightly, it's not so clear, or the federal constitution is not so explicit on all matters of subnational constitutionalism. In the Austrian case, we do have at least some provisions, but not everything that would be interesting with regards to subnational constitutional autonomy is explicitly regulated by the federal constitution. I think one difference is you have a Supreme Court, we do have a specific constitutional court, but this is just perhaps a formal difference. When it comes to the examination of laws, there is no difference in Austria between the scrutiny of a federal law or state law. So the Constitutional Court is neither more generous nor stricter or whatever. However, the benchmark is different. So the federal constitution is on top of the legal hierarchy of norms. It is beyond everything. Ordinary federal laws, but also the land constitution and land ordinary laws and everything else. And of course, here we have a benchmark. So the Constitutional Court can repeal a land constitutional law only when it violates the federal constitution. It cannot repeal a land constitution because it violates, let's say, a federal ordinary law or so. But the effects resulting from the repeal of a land constitutional law, these effects, legally speaking, are the same as if the Constitutional Court would repeal an ordinary federal law, for example. So there is no difference in that. And I wouldn't say, I mentioned those three cases, but even if you look at these three cases, you'll find the court is not always so severe. I think mostly in the case regarding direct democracy, regarding popular legislation. In the climate protection case, the court did not repeal the provision of the land constitution, but only said it was not applicable to federal laws and matters regulated by federal laws. Whereas in the last case I mentioned regarding the Court of Auditors, on the one hand, it did not repeal one land constitutional provision that just said the Regional Court of Auditors shall do something which the Federal Court of Auditors does not do. But on the other hand, repeated another provision which said, well, and the Constitutional Court is empowered to scrutinize conflicts arising from that additional power. So that was 50-50, so to say. On the whole, I would say the Austrian Constitutional Court perhaps decides every few years or so. There is a case dealing with or repealing also a land constitutional provision. It is not done every day or so. And one cannot say that the Austrian Constitutional Court has a hostile attitude towards the land. One cannot say that. But yes, there are cases in which the Constitutional Court was restrictive. That's true for Austria as well.
Okay, thank you for your answer. In Brazil, it seems that the Supreme Court subjected the subnational law to a kind of strict scrutiny. Then, in the doubt, the subnational law is unconstitutional, even to the point due to the state constitutions were considered to invalid dispositions or to regulate, for example, your their own amendment process or the process of impeachment of their own government. There are governors. then it's a problem. In Brazilian law, a so severe interference of Supreme Court in the subnational autonomy and subnational constitutional space. A second question, please. You mentioned the Constitution of Vienna. And in Brazil, the constitutional status of the municipalities, as Professor Johanna Schnabel, that have some researches also in Brazil, also with Brazilian partners, as Professor Johanna knows, the municipalities have in Brazilian constitutional law a singular position. They are considered part of the federation and have a degree of autonomy that is similar of those of the states, and have even their own charters. And there is some discussion of the legal nature of those charters, if it's constitutional or not. You mentioned, Professor Gamper, the Constitution of Vienna, and I confess that I am curious about this constitution, because I know that in German there is three Stadtstaaten, three city-states that have also include assent in Bundesrat, in the Federal Council. Then can you explain a little bit about the status of this Constitution of Vienna? Is a constitution of a city, a municipality, or it's some different? It's a lander, correctly understood?
Yes, absolutely. So we have 9 Länder, and one is a city-state, and that is Vienna. And Vienna is a Land. It's a Land. It's also a municipality in a parallel way, and it's also the capital of Austria. That is the unique feature. But it only has the constitution because it is a Land. So just because it's a Land, it does have a constitution as the other 8 Länder as well, not because it is a municipality. So municipalities in Austria are regulated by the federal constitution quite extensively. Otherwise, it is a power of the regions to regulate them in detail. But they clearly have a subordinate position. So there is no discussion about their having a status like a constituent component region or whatever. Of course, there is some literature on that. We talk about a kind of 3-partner federalism with a question mark, and then always the answer is no. There's one exception, and that is fiscal equalization, because we have a strong type of fiscal equalization in Austria. And here, the revenues shared between the 3 tiers, federation, Länder, and municipalities. Here, the municipalities come into play as a kind of 3rd tier, 3rd partner, but otherwise they have a subordinate position. And the Constitution of Vienna is a constitution because it's a Land. It has the name City Constitution, Stadtverfassung, we would say in German. But this is just a name. It is not because it is a city, but because it's a land, which is a city. And there is also a small chapter in the federal constitution which includes just some specific provisions because of that very particular situation of Vienna, which just address Vienna. But in all other issues, Vienna has the same status as every other land.
Thank you so much. Then in Austrian constitutional law, there is no Kommunalverfassungsrecht like they say in Germany. It seems about the 3 city-states. I'm wrong, or I'm...
Yeah, the federal constitution includes a chapter which, again, consists of several provisions which regulate municipalities. For example, that there needs to be a mayor and a local council, and the local council has to be elected in this or that way. So, and also that the municipalities have something which we call autonomous tasks, where they have a kind of self-government, but this cannot be compared to the Länder. They neither have legislative powers, nor are they represented in a federal second chamber, nor anything else. So we call that chapter Kommunalverfassung, communal constitutional law, but this is, the name is just used for a part of the federal constitution which regulates municipalities. But this does not mean that the municipalities themselves would be allowed to enact their own local constitutions, except Vienna, because it is a land.
Perfect. It's federal constitutional law.
Yeah.
Okay. Last question, if I can. There is any case and interesting cases of conflict or concurrences between the federal fundamental rights and the subnational fundamental rights? There is some criteria to solve, for example, concurrent situations between more or less protective rights in different levels of
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, theoretically, that could be the case, because we do know that fundamental rights in general may collide. So even if you look at the fundamental rights guaranteed in one and the same document at the same level, for example, the rights entrenched in the European Convention of Human Rights, even these rights could collide. Because, if you enjoy as a bearer of one right, if that right is interpreted radically, this may collide with the right of another person, the same right or another right. So fundamental rights sometimes collide, theoretically at least, and practically that's possible. But there are no practical cases where we find such a collision in Austria between a federal constitutional right and a land constitutional right. On the contrary, so some land constitutions entrench and repeat the same rights which are already granted at federal constitutional level, so they rather support what is already granted at the federal constitutional level. And then they entrench some constitutions, some few additional rights with regard to social welfare, for example. That is perhaps the most prominent example. But here we don't have a collision, because we don't have a social welfare right in the federal constitution. There's no collision. One interesting example can be found in the Tyrolean constitution, in the country where I live, in my own region, because here the land constitution says if somebody in the region of Tyrol is expropriated because a land law says that person can be expropriated under certain circumstances, then a compensation must be given, full compensation under all circumstances, which is good to the citizens if they are expropriated, which is not so good. However, at the federal constitutional level, we do also have a fundamental right of property. But here, if somebody is expropriated, the compensation is not always fully granted, but only under certain conditions, if it's proportional, and there are also some other conditions, so not under all circumstances. So this means if somebody is expropriated, then the compensation will be better or given under all circumstances in the Tyrolean case because of the land constitution, whereas in the federal constitutional case, it may not be like that in all cases. However, this is not a collision, but just something, something more beneficial, something that is supplemented by the land constitution.
Thank you so much, Professor Gamper. I'm sorry. Professor Jared, can we try again your audio?
How is this working?
Perfectly.
Ah.
Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you for your patience. I apologize so much.
No, no, it's great. It's great.
Um, well, I can try to be quick as well. Um, uh, uh, do I share my presentation through the Presenteer? Do I share it on my side, or do you share the
Uh,
slides?
you share, please, yeah, and I put on the screen. Please, you click on the bottom bubble
Ah, okay,
and choose slides,
okay.
please. Then
One
when
second.
I can see it, I can
Gotcha.
share on the screen.
Ah, okay. One second. Do, do, do.
It's a button below with a plus sign in it. Then the option slides.
It should be uploading now.
Okay, thank you. I will introduce you to the audience then. Agora eu vou passar a palavra, resolvido esse problema técnico com o áudio do professor Jared Sonnicksen, eu vou passar a palavra a ele, que vai proferir a sua conferência, que é sobre o tema Subnational Constitutionalism in a Tightly Coupled Federal System, the Case of German Länder. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, Professor Jared. And I give floor to you to make your presentation.
Yes, so thank you. Thank you so much for this invitation, uh, Luis. Thank you to the attendees who are here in the virtual room. It's good to see you again as well, Anna Gamper and Johanna Schnabel virtually. Um, in I know there's the saying in English to save the best for last. But there's always exceptions to rules. But I'll try my best. Subnational constitutionalism in a tightly coupled federal system, in the case of the German Länder. So this will be embedded in a comparative perspective. Um, I'm a political scientist with an interest in constitutional law and the constitution's constitutionalization of politics, but I'm not a lawyer. Let me start with an image that I keep coming back to whenever I talk about federalism um, and challenges. Namely, that what I think is if you study federalism, whether it's lawyer or political scientist, you deal with problems that are necessarily of a cross-border nature at some point, right? Anna Gamper's case, also dealing with environmental legislation, Johanna Schnabel, this complex case of housing, problems transcend borders either because of competences um, that do not match with the space of the problem itself, right? Or the problem might be localized, but the competences are somewhere else. So these are tensions, right? There's the problem space and the competence in the sense of power space. And any political system, any political community must grapple with these issues. But I think when you work with federalism, you become very sensitized to that. And so this is a picture, of course, of the pandemic and the virus. I think this is an exceptional image, an analogy of that, right? The worldwide problem. And the pandemic that literally means pandemos, so all of the people. But law and politics are contained in spaces that have to grapple with cross-border problems. And this connects very much so to the German case, I would say, for both descriptive analytical reasons and some normative reasons. You know, how do you cope with, let's say, interdependencies, cross-border problems? And that has quite a bit to do with how the constitutionalism in a multi-level system, I think, is organized. Um, So that's sort of my primer and my analogy, this image of the big picture, I guess, that makes uh, uh, federalism in general so interesting. And what's interesting perhaps about the German case? Well, when I was preparing, I'm not an expert on subnational constitutionalism, so the invitation was an example to also remind my own self. So, what are some special things about subnational constitutionalism? And really quick, I think it has multiple meanings in and of itself, and then in particular relevance for federalism. I mean, subnational constitutionalism evokes or hints at a kind of process, right? It can be referring to the mere existence of having constitutions at a uh, um, subnational level, the capacity as well as the propensity, so the capacity, but the also measurable extent of constitutional change in practice, and as well as further practices tied to the Constitution in practice. If you're interested in, or we are interested in national constitutionalism, there are of course different kinds. Do all of the subnational units have those same scopes of constitutionalism or and constitutional capacity? Also, the capacity to change their own constitutions, or is this asymmetrically um, uh, distributed? And then, of course, how is the subnational constitutionalism embedded in the wider community itself? Is it I hope this word makes sense. Compartmentalized, so in watertight jurisdictions, independent of one another, or are there linkages among the communities themselves, or relevance in the multi-level space? How that subconstitutionalism is lived out in the interactions between the levels. And then there's of course the politics of subnational constitutionalism. What are their drivers? Attempts to redistribute the competences to the subnational units, using subconstitutional politics to adapt to changes as well as to accommodate diversities in a political community. And constitutional courts have sometimes been called a permanent constitutional convention because of their power to judicial review. So they change the constitution in practice. The German case, we can say, now moving from this more general comparative, what are some criteria that we would use to compare subnational constitutionalisms? And again, none of this is original on my part. I should point out, of course. Some things we can already tick off on the checklist, right? The German Länder, we can say they all have a constitution, capacities for formal and informal constitutional changes, further relevant practices of governance that link either tightly or loosely to the Länder constitutions as well as the federal constitution. In the past decades, we should say also the European level, the being integrated in the European Union trickles down also to the constitutional development at Länder level. I'll illustrate an example of that in a moment. I would say it's symmetric subnational constitutionalism. There's no special rights. It's not like I think you've heard about the Canadian case, if I'm not mistaken, at another point. Or if you know about the Canadian case, there's not the same, or the Spanish case, not the same distribution necessarily of constitutional or quasi-constitutional rights. The German case is pretty easy in this regard. It's a rather symmetric subnational constitutional capacity. Every land has its own constitution and can determine how the rules of how it is changed. And all of the Länder, like at federal level, have at the same time their own land level constitutional courts. So that's the brief sketch of the German case in this sort of checklist. The title talk mentions the phrase tight coupling, and I want to be brief. If I may go into, I'll skip this. If I could go briefly into where this term comes from. Coupling is and bear with me, I hope this is okay that I do a bit of theoretical sketching. Coupling is a systems theoretical concept, and it's been adopted by multiple scholars. My influence in this regard is the comparative federalism scholar Arthur Benz, who was my mentor during my postdoc, with whom I worked closely together. We also did an edited volume on these linkages between federalism and democracy and how they interlink. The Constitution is, of course, always in the background in a federal democracy as sort of the linchpin of a federation and a democratically constituted one. The concept itself with coupling has to do with different kinds of subsystems and how they are connected or coupled with one another. Tightly coupled, then the systems are highly integrated. Loosely coupled, then interact, may have more loose or more slack in the way they interact with one another, and decoupled, detached more from one another. There's no one best way of linking institutions of federal governance and democratic governance. They all come with their own challenges. And for example, a decoupled system allows for the autonomy of a subsystem to work on its own better. In the federal system, if the states are completely watertight, detached from each other, and the institutions of democratic governance are also compartmentalized, well, you have a coherence within those units, and the constitutional authority is a nice match of coherency. But dealing with cross-border issues becomes difficult if there's few interlinkages between them. One way of improving or enhancing the interlinkages is to regulate this in the Constitution. So don't strictly delineate competences here, there, and there, and level A is responsible for that and also its implementation. Level B is responsible for one thing and its implementation, and level C is responsible for the other thing and its implementation. And they're all on their own. Another way of doing that is to regulate through a constitution that task number one has to be done by all three together. I think Johanna's example goes in that direction, certainly quite complex, how the law regulates competences so that now all the levels have to interact in a complex way, and the Constitution can play an important role in distributing those powers for one and prescribing how those tasks are met. That tightly couples the levels to each other by law through actual policy-making processes. But of course that can come with some drawbacks. It's more susceptible to particular tensions if the levels cannot agree, if there's political conflicts between them, and if they cannot make joint decisions or reach compromises with each other. Resolving that problem becomes in a deadlock because neither level can now go back on its own and try to resolve it, because the Constitution prescribes that they all have to work together and they can't work unilaterally. I'm hinting now at another concept that is related to this coupling concept from Fritz Scharpf, the joint decision-making trap. When you have an arrangement where multiple levels have to work with one another, they can fall into a trap if they can't reach a compromise, and unilateral action is not an option. So this could be a trap. I'll stop with that theoretical conceptual mapping now. Let me skip these because we lost time and go straight now to the actual case at hand, the German case. So what does this all have to do with Germany and the Länder and subnational constitutionalism? So here's a map of the Federal Republic of Germany, and it's 16 Länder. I already preluded my checklist of subnational constitutionalism features in the German case. All 16 Länder, what underpins this having a constitution, this feature of subnational constitutionalism in formal legal terms, is the very fact that they all have their own constitutions as well as constitutional courts. Not all Länder always had constitutional courts, but meanwhile they do. I think the laggard, the latecomer was Schleswig-Holstein in the north, but has now introduced for quite some time now also a constitutional court. With regard to the variety in propensities to formal change, so the capacity to change the constitution, all of the Länder have this. They have the autonomy to change their own constitutions. And the propensity. Well, there's a term most of you may or may not know called constitutional rigidity. So the flexibility or lack thereof to change a constitution. So how high are the thresholds, the rules? How difficult is it to amend the constitution? The Länder have a average level of rigidity. It's not simple majority, it's not 50 plus X absolute majority, but 2/3 majority. And this is nothing exceptional, but a higher threshold than regular lawmaking. Astrid Lorentz is a good person to go to in the literature if you're interested in comparative federalism literature or in general, comparative constitutions and measuring rigidity of constitutions. But how about the frequency of change? Here we have a broad spectrum. Some Länder are quite happy or quite active in changing their constitutions, and others not so much. The range is the Brandenburg, which is has a single-digit amount of constitutional changes, and then we have the state of Rhineland-Pfalz that has witnessed over 200 constitutional changes since 1949. I should say Brandenburg has only been a state after German reunification since 1990. Nevertheless, that's 30 going on 34 years now, and single-digit changes to the Constitution is not quite very frequent. So either they're very happy with their Constitution, but it's not a factor of the rigidity, because they have the same rigidity as all of the other Länder. Interesting to note, just for the German case, we have maybe two quite important features of constitutional foundings in the German case. I think Johanna already hinted at this with the foundation of Western Germany, or the actual name, the Federal Republic of Germany, after the Second World War in 1949. But it was the West German Länder that were established as political units before Western Germany became its own country. So we do have a coming together of already established Länder in 1949, at least in the Western German occupied zones. And the second wave of constitutional foundation in 1989 and 1990, with the crumbling of the East German authoritarian regime, we have a reestablishment of the Länder as well in East Germany. So Saxony, I can go back to the map, you can see it real quick, sorry. So here are those states that were were Eastern Germany that join or reunite with Western Germany in 1990. But they reestablish as states and accede to Western Germany. So we have two periods of constitutional foundations, if you will. That being said, one is more an enlargement than an enlargement or accession into the Western German case. Interestingly, I said I'll be quick, so let me hurry up. Interestingly, we talk a lot about one of the values of subnational constitutionalism, the abilities for, let's say, experimentalism, but the Länder have very, very similar systems of government. This is not unusual, though, if we look at federal countries. But all of the Länder have a parliamentary system of government, so not like Brazil or in most Latin American and up to the U.S. Countries, they're parliamentary, and this is the case in all of the Länder. And they have a unitary executive, so no separate head of state. The Land Prime Minister, called Ministerpräsident, the Minister President, serves as head of state and head of government. Interestingly, the Länder have a range of direct democratic instruments, and just for fun fact or what have you, here reunification had an impact. A rediffusion of influence on the old Western German Länder that saw a wave in the 1990s of introducing direct democratic instruments. So the Eastern German Länder in founding new states, here we have a sort of a usage of that constitutional innovation. The Eastern German Länder introduce at the same time of becoming new democracies, also introducing a lot of direct democratic instruments at Land level. And this has influenced a spillover effect, if you will, to the Western German Länder. And it's well established at local and Land level in Germany, direct democracy. Not as a vibrant practice perhaps as in Brazil or Austria or Switzerland, but it's not little either. For comparative note, what is interesting, as I mentioned, in most federal democracies, we see a kind of isomorphism in the system of government, even though there's a constitutional autonomy. I don't know enough about the Brazilian case, how it looks in the Brazilian states. I know in the United States, in Austria, in Switzerland, there's a lot of isomorphism that the subnational units have similar forms of government to the national level. In the U.S., it even is so. It's even so extensive that the state level has bicameral legislatures, even though the states themselves are not federal. In Germany, there's a bit more consistency in this regard. They're unicameral legislatures, so we do have a stark difference to the federal level, and they're single executives, another stark difference to the federal level. So there is a bit of a divergence from the isomorphism that is quite typical of federal democracies, for whatever reason that may be. Now, federal constitutions at work, the Länder constitutions are endowed with policy areas, but here we come to the one major difference, the tightly coupled system. A number of the things that Länder can do are embedded in these community and joint tasks. So there's the community task in the strict sense. These are tasks where Land and federal government have to carry out these tasks together and decide in a large consensus up to unanimity. And then there's shared competences where at federal level the Länder representatives decide together with the federal parliament on a joint law, and the Länder then implement it. So there's a joint decision making on a policy area, and the Länder have to implement it. And this is, though, not in the subnational constitutions, but regulated in the federal constitution. subnational constitutionalism at work is Karl Löwenstein was a classic constitutional scholar, political science mix. He made a classic differentiation between constitutional text and constitutional practice. And the constitutional practice in Germany, even though those areas where the Länder have their own competence and they don't have to, they could go unilaterally, and I think Johanna Schnabel could tell us a lot more about this. There's an intensive exercise of forming joint commissions, cooperative fora, that the Länder horizontally, even in those areas where they could go it alone and do unilateral policy making, without formal constitutional rules, this sort of joint decision making constitutional pattern permeates or has diffused into also policy-making practice, even in those areas where the Länder could govern alone. Finally, constitutional review has dynamics also in a multi-level perspective that trickle down or into the Länder themselves. Even though the Länder have their own constitutional courts, I mean, relevant can also be here the German Federal Constitutional Review with a specific view to Länder constitution making or how they implement their own constitutions. I mean, one particular way is, I mentioned beforehand, I think where we see quite a bit of diversity in the constitutions is how the German Länder design their municipality orders or the Ordnungen, how their communal orders. This is, of course, a difference again to Brazil. Which I know, Luis, you could. There's an article by you also with the Stadtluft macht frei about the autonomy at the local level in Brazil, which is fascinating, of course, for us federalism nerds to have a local level where where we have a federal unit. The Länder have used this diversity we see even to a more stronger sense, roughly comparison than in policy making, sometimes in how they design their democratic instruments. But the Constitutional Court has declared unconstitutional the 5% threshold for elections, for voting at local level. At federal level, there's a 5% threshold for a party to get into parliament. For the Länder, there's a 5% threshold for the parties to get into parliament. But the Constitutional Court has declared this unconstitutional at local level, even though this is in the ambit of the Länder. And they declared it unconstitutional for elections to the European level. So there's multiple dimensions here where the Federal Constitutional Court has intervened in that democratic shaping subnational constitutional leverage. The logic of the German Constitutional Court is, I would say a bit idiosyncratic. I wouldn't agree with the argument, but it's logical. Of course, these are smart people, but I don't find it convincing. It's an intervention either way you slice it into the Länder capacity to regulate these democratic instruments. And of course, the European level affects in the dynamics the lands themselves. I mean, a very concrete, palpable case is the introduction of balanced budgets and debt reduction into the Länder constitutions. But this is very much driven by commitments actually to the European level. The Maastricht criteria regarding currency union rules and so forth, and this we can only understand through this multi-level dynamic process. So finally, I started out with, I guess, that big picture. Maybe it's too much of a big jump. I guess what I want to say is, having separate, less coupled federalism, democracy, constitutionalism provides you more autonomy, and that's the tightly coupled version can place severe limitations on not only policy experimentation potentials, but even constitutional political ones. On the other hand, this arrangement has some benefits to be taken seriously with regard to managing interdependencies. And here's another inspiration I've taken from Arthur Bentz as a sort of now the classical dilemma in federal democratic governance is that to find that balancing act between autonomy and interdependence, and both need to be grappled with in federal democratic governance. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jared Sonnicksen. So much aspects of interest. I think that the relationship between federalism and democracy is one of the most challenging themes, and it's not a simple relationship. You mentioned it, and it's very interesting. And the problem of the cross-border issues that you mentioned is really a problem to be resolved for any kind of pluralistic or polycentric state. Can be a federal state, can be a regional state. There are always these problems that don't recognize the limitations, legal or political limitations, and need to be resolved. I recently made a research, a postdoctoral research, and even in a system like Brazilian, that is that has as a feature uniformity, there are space for some innovation and subnational innovation. We have investigated the subnational ecological and climatic constitution. And in this material, in this topic, the subnational constitutionalism in Brazil is very independent from the federal one. Then the main characteristic or feature of Brazilian multi-level constitutionalism, that is the top-down processes. In this field is another one. Then it seems very interesting. So many aspects of your speech. Thank you so much to share with us all of this. I find your speech very interesting. And only a final remark. Even with all this uniformity and isomorphism, there is some space for relevant subnational innovation. I think that the main example that I know, at least, is the Verfassung Beschwerde, that is originated from the Bayern lander, and then is diffused to other landers and to the federal system. Then I think that the subnational constitutional space is important to this experimentation of new institutions, like the one Professor Gamper mentioned, of the popular legislation. Very interesting innovation that unfortunately or no, was ruled unconstitutional by the federal constitutional court. Thank you so much, Professor. I think that we are almost running out of time, but I have a question to Professor Johanna Schnabel, very objectively, very simply. In Brazil, we have a three-tiered federation, as you know, and many of the politics that are shared between federal, state, and local governments are in the past decades are object of a municipalization, an intense municipalization, and this could be interpreted by some scholars and researchers as a strategy of the federal government to avoid difficulties with the state governments motivated by partisan politics. In your interesting research about affordable housing in those 4 countries, have you seen something in this sense like we have in Brazil? For example, this specific policy in Brazil, affordable housing, is mainly federally guided, but especially direct with the municipalities and not with the governments of the states because of in the first government of President Lula, several of the the governors are of parties, political parties that was opposition to the federal government. You have some aspect in this sense in your research, Professor Johanna.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Very important and relevant one. And I think that's where, of course, Brazil in a way is a very specific case for several, well, for one main reason, and that reason is that in many other countries, the federal government cannot offer grants directly to local government because local government is a jurisdiction of the constituent units. So in Germany, it's very, very limited. I think there are few instances where municipalities can directly access federal money, but in most cases, if the federal government wants to provide support to municipalities, it needs to give that money to the lender who will then hand it on to municipalities. Now in Austria, to be honest, I'm not quite sure how it works. I imagine it's quite similar, but Anna Gamper might be able to help out. I know how, and I haven't seen anything like that happening in affordable housing policy. When looking at that now, I know that in Canada, it's a thing. In Canada, the federal government has on occasion bypassed the provinces. It's something they call hourglass federalism, because you have that narrow neck, which is the provinces, and then the sand running from the money in this case, running from federal government to municipalities. That's an issue. Provinces are not very happy with that. So that's a situation where I know that where it has led to certain problems. I'm not quite sure whether that's related to party politics or just to the federal government wanting to have more influence on municipalities, because obviously, and that's something we know from research on Germany, if the federal government gives money to the lender can still use that to set their own priorities. They might make it, they cannot change the policy, of course, they cannot change the conditions, but they can make it more easier or more difficult for municipalities to access the money, for instance, which is also a way of influencing policy.
Thank you so much, Professor. In Brazil, we have made a study about the origins of this kind of neofederalism that includes the municipalities in the federation, and it seems to be a bottom-up diffusion of a model. It's a model that existed since the final of the 19th century in Rio Grande do Sul state, at the extreme south of Brazil. But it seems to be a strategy to avoid the difficulties with the states of the federation, and in some measure a strategy to diminish, to how can I say this, to dilute the power of the governor, the state organs and the state governors. It's quite interesting. It's in the study that Professor Jared mentioned. I think that I'm sorry. I would like to make a lot of other questions and reflections, but I think that we are out of time. I need only to thank you all once again, and your participation, your kindness, and in share your time with us. Thank you so much, Professors Gamper, Schnabel, and Sonnicksen. We have learned a lot today. I think that there is a lot of things to reflect on this amazing your amazing conference. Thank you so much. Pessoal, eu vou estar passando a lista agora de presença no chat. Muito obrigado pela presença. Thank you so much. I hope to see you soon, maybe in person. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, I would love to be delighted to stay in contact. That would be...
For sure. We will
Okay.
make this. Thank you.
Okay. Ciao.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.